Well, good morning and welcome once again to Elevenses. I'm Kevin Williams of Survival Skills Rider Training, and this is my twice weekly webcast, and it is show number 355, and it's Sunday the 30th of July. So, what have we got for you in today's show? Well, emergency services are to get a direct connection to the eCall systems that operate on modern cars and, of course, are optional extras on BMWs. The High Court has cleared the London ULEZ extension. The MCIA are calling for immediate changes to bike training. A car carrier with electric cars is ablaze in the North Sea. A bendy indicator, could it solve bodywork damage from minor drops? Does come at a price though. Could Harley be about to reveal a new 440 Nightster? And an Aprilia RS440 is expected this autumn. And finally, today's in-depth session at the end of the show, I'll be looking at a couple of road safety interventions, a scheme in Dorset, another one in northwest Scotland, and how they are actually collecting evidence for those road safety interventions. It's a surprisingly in-depth exercise, so stay tuned for the end of the show for that one. So don't forget, if you've got a question, if you've got a comment, if you've got anything you'd like to say, I will try and get back to you during the show if I possibly can, and if I can't, I will get back to you when the show is over. Right, so new feature today, just a quick shout out for all the people who have supported this show over the last month. Helen, thank you. She also bought the Tarmac Tactics ebook. Ian, Nigel, NJ, Damo, Clive, Brian, Paul, Christine, Claire, Chels Keitel, Living Martial Arts, Johan, Mad Cockney, Howard, Kevin, Hallam, and some anonymous supporters too. Your support is greatly appreciated, so thank you very, very much to those people. I shall make it a regular feature of the show every Sunday from now on to give a quick thank you to those people who have dropped me a cuppa over on my coffee page. And Terry's hooked in. Good morning to you, Terry. Well, good evening actually for you out in Australia. Starts again. You're frighten the life out of you by saying you're in Australia. New Zealand. I was thinking of the Women's World Cup, of course, which is happening out in Australia and New Zealand right at this moment. Right, okay, good stuff. So on with the news. Now, the first thing I just want to say is that if you've been driving around in a modern car, you probably have found that you have a SOS button in the car. Now this is connected to the eCall SOS software, which has been mandatory, I believe, since 2018 on new cars sold in the EU. Now that's what I was just wanted to bring up. You can manually activate it by pressing the SOS button, or the eCall system is actually triggered in the event of a collision in which airbags are deployed. Now, of course, what comes for cars sooner or later turns up for motorcycles, and this is actually the eCall system, which is an optional extra on BMWs. That's a zoom in on the picture, and you can see the SOS button there lives under a flap next to your starter, so you have to remove the flap to get to it, so it's not likely to be triggered by accident. I believe it also goes off if the bike topples or is involved in a sort of a sudden stop. Now, eCall isn't yet mandated on bikes, but it is an optional extra for BMWs. Yamaha was said to be working on a system back in 2021. I don't know if they've got any further with that, but anyway, that's what the eCall system is. The data that it collects, though, until now has not been utilised directly by the emergency services. Instead, the data goes to an eCall handling centre, and they then have to do the business and phone up the emergency services. Now, that's all about to change with a 6-month trial which will actually transmit the real-time data that is collected by the eCall system direct to emergency services with the aim of speeding up collision response times. As you probably know, it's that sort of response time which is absolutely crucial in turning serious injuries, preventing them from becoming fatal injuries. So this has been developed by a company called SoS Systems, and emergency responders will get crucial data which includes a vehicle's exact location, the make and model, the fuel type or whether it's electric, and that is important because collisions involving electric vehicles are turning out to require additional fire tenders due to the risk of an intense fire. You'll also get data on the number of occupants. It's also said to inform if there are vulnerable people on board, but how the system knows that I really don't know. Now, the system will be initially supported by Surrey and Warwickshire Fire and Rescue Services, and others across the country will be targeted to take part. Now, Dan Quinn, he's the Chief Fire Officer for Surrey Fire and Rescue Service, and he's also the National Fire Chiefs Council lead for road safety and road rescue, said, "I'm delighted that Surrey Fire and Rescue Service are working with partners to incorporate the call data from eCall technology into our emergency response. This breakthrough will revolutionise our ability to serve and protect the community. We're pleased to be finally accessing this invaluable data which has been available for some time." So let's hope motorcycle manufacturers start fitting eCall to bikes, but let's hope it's a standard fitting. It shouldn't be a pay for extra. Right, okay, so in other news, the High Court here in London has ruled against a legal challenge to Sadiq Khan's proposed extension to the London Ultra-Low Emission Zone, ULEZ. As a result, the ULEZ expansion has been deemed lawful and it can proceed as planned. You probably recall London boroughs Hillingdon, Bexley, Bromley and Harrow, along with Surrey County Council, they all launched the court action which challenged the proposal to extend the ULEZ boundary, but they've now failed on that. So basically it means that the extension is going ahead as planned next month, and it will take the ULEZ zone out to the area bounded more or less by the M25 motorway, and if you drive a non-compliant vehicle you'll be subject to a £12.50 charge. Right, okay, don't forget, session reminder, the 11ses goes out Sundays and Wednesdays at 11, almost always live, very occasionally a recorded show. I'll probably be popping a couple of those up next month because I have a pretty busy month, and very rarely I miss a show altogether. So do set yourself a reminder, do come along, and if you can't make it live, do remember that all the shows are over in their playlist on my Survival Skills UK YouTube channel. Okay, so what else in the news? Well, the Motorcycle Industry Association isn't pulling any punches now. You'll recall from the previous stories there have been an industry letter has gone out to the government to take immediate action on motorcycle training. Now let's just have a quick recap of how the current tiered test system came about. Now in 2006 the EU brought in the Driving Licence Directive, which required mandatory theory test and graduated access to bigger motorcycles. Now the way the rules were laid out meant that after passing a test on a 11 kilowatt 14.6 horsepower 125, the youngest riders would in fact find themselves restricted to riding that 125. So basically you took the test on the bike that you were going to ride anyway. So now the access to the intermediate machines, the 35 kilowatt, roughly 46 horsepower, sort of CB500 is a typical bike in that class, that would come only when you reach the age of 21, and the biggest machines, the unrestricted license, would only be available to riders over 25 when they were supposed to be more mature, and the stated aim was to improve road safety. Now when the UK came to implement the EU regulation, the DFT and the DVSA between them decided that when riders had passed a test on a lower step of this graduated access ladder, access to the next tier, for example, if you were stepping up from a 125, on which you'd passed your test, to an A2 machine, that could only be achieved by retaking the entire full-blown bike test. So a rider who'd already passed Module 1 and Module 2 on the 125 would reach the correct age to move up to the next tier, but they would then have to repeat both Module 1 and Module 2 to gain access to the A2 bike. And they would need to retake the full motorcycle test, both modules, for a third time to gain an unrestricted license. Now, the result should have been obvious, at least it was to me. The youngest riders, they'd simply stopped taking the bike test, since what was the point in taking a test on the 125 if all you got was the ability to take your old plates off and ride the same bike? So what we've created is a new generation of Hells Angels riding around on L plates, waiting till they're 21, and then they're old enough to take the intermediate A2 license. So for something like 4 years, these riders, their only training has been the wholly inadequate CBT. Now, not surprisingly, since youngest riders are overrepresented in bike crash stats, they're particularly at risk, there's no evidence that step licenses have made any difference to crash rates, says the MCIA. I haven't got access to that data, but I see no reason to disbelieve it. The Department of Transport consulted with the motorcycle industry on the license structure in 2016, so the best part 10 years after it was announced. 12 changes were subsequently approved and announced by the DVSA in December 2017, and the two of the most important of those were the need to pass a theory test either before or as part of your CBT, and the introduction of a training course which would allow a full motorcycle license to be upgraded rather than having to take a fresh test. So you do training on your bigger bike rather than just take it out and have a test on it. Now, few people seem to realise that that option to have a training course to progress through the licence tiers was actually part of the EU regulation in the first place. So it's nothing to do with Brexit freedoms or other things that some people have been saying. It was actually built into the EU regulation. So all we're doing is bringing into play what was always something that the UK government could have chosen if they wanted to. Now, as you probably know, those improvements which were talked about 6 years ago still haven't been implemented, and now the MCIA's Director for Safety and Training, Karen Cole, she's spoken to the Motorcycle newspaper, and she said there is no more time for excuses, we need to crack on. And she called the requirement to repeat the same Module 1 and Module 2 tests ridiculous, and taking the same test on a slightly bigger bike, it's not teaching you anything. It's just saying I'm at the same standard I was 2 years ago. And frankly, I agree with her. That's all that passing a new test does when you've got a bigger test bike. Right, okay. Also in the news this week, if you've been following what's going on out in the channel, you'll discover that the 199 metre long Fremantle Highway is on fire. As of yesterday, it was burning for the 4th consecutive day, and it was floating around 17 miles off the Dutch coast. The ship left the Netherlands, and it was intending to pass down the English Channel when the fire broke out and it lost power. Now, on Thursday, a Dutch Coast Guard said that the cause of the fire was unknown, but a spokesperson for the Japanese transport company K-Line, which chartered the car carrier, said there were 3,783 vehicles on board. Now, that spokesperson declined to comment on the kinds of car brands that were on board, but press reports say that they include almost 3,000 Mercedes and BMW vehicles. And it's also further been reported that the total includes 498 battery vehicles. Now, naturally, There's no word yet on what has started the fire, but speculation is that it could have been an electric car battery that ignited. Now, cars with lithium-ion batteries, they apparently have fewer fires than diesel or gasoline cars, but if they do catch fire, then they become hard to put out because the battery construction itself, each cell contains some flammable gel, and of course pouring too much water onto a ship could cause it to sink, with all the resulting environmental issues. So at the moment they're still struggling to put this fire out. That's what I know on that particular one. Right, okay, so I do like to keep an eye on what I think are useful bike parts. I've got some comments to read. Let's have a look at those. Who have we got on? We've got Nigel saying good morning. Yep, he says for some reason it's getting harder and harder to find you on Facebook. Well, that is why I suggest that you follow my coffee page and you follow my YouTube channel, and if you subscribe to my Substack mail, you will get an alert, of course, to remind you that these shows are on every Sunday. Terry says the golden hour mantra is arguably a myth. I don't know about that. I mean, everything I've read suggests that yeah, if you do get to casualties quickly, then they do have an improved chance of survival. Certainly that's been the policy in Europe for a very long time. The Germans actually went as far as to build trauma centres up and down their motorways to minimise the amount of time that crash victims were being transported to hospitals. Nigel says see you later. Kevin says good morning, and Terry says that's the second car carrier in 2 years to catch fire. Right, okay, I didn't know about the previous one. Anyway, right, thanks for that. Right, so back to where I was talking about some repairs to bikes being a pain in the neck. Probably the most irritating one is the hole punched in a motorcycle fairing or a piece of bodywork by a indicator which gets broken. Now, it's not the fact that the indicator is expensive, they usually are, but it's fixing what they're mounted to. Now, the first bike that I owned had the indicators mounted directly to the headlamp bracket, so you can pretty much guess what happened when the inevitable happened and I dropped that bike. It bent the headlamp bracket so the headlight didn't point where it was supposed to. That was relatively easy to straighten out as it was just sort of mild steel. Then I got a bike with rear indicators that were mounted directly into the plastic rear mudguard. I dropped that bike, the indicator ripped out a chunk of the plastic in the mudguard. I managed to fix that. I can't remember how. I think if memory serves right, I used industrial staples. Anyway, my Hornet has the indicators bolted directly to what would be a brittle plastic fairing, and here is the sort of thing that can happen if you do drop a bike with this kind of setup. Now that's actually a Kawasaki, and fortunately my Honda has never been over on its side, but if it had, I feel pretty sure I would be feeling this rider's pain. So the worst result actually I ever saw of one of these incidents was a Triumph. Now, it's one of the only two bikes that's actually been dropped out on the road on one of my training courses, and what happened was actually the rider was turning right. She had a sort of stop go moment, and on her second stop she lost her balance. The bike was actually at a standstill by that point. The bike toppled over and the indicator took the brunt of the impact because it was a sticky out indicator on a Triumph Triple, and it turned out that for some bizarre design reason the indicator was bolted actually physically into the radiator. There were two holes in the radiator, and the bolts went directly through into the radiator matrix. So when she dropped the bike, it not only snapped the indicator off, but it strained those threaded holes, so that even though the bolts were still in place, as soon as she restarted the engine, coolant sprayed out of it, which was bonkers. Anyway, unfortunately it cost her quite a lot of money to fix that, because it needed a new radiator, which is appalling piece of design. So what are the alternatives? Well, you can go for something like this, a flush mount indicator. Horrid things, you can't see them from the side very easily. You certainly can't see them from anything other than directly ahead, and they had nasty little bulbs in which used to blow a lot and weren't very bright. So horrid things those. Rather better, my Yamaha has indicators which are pop off. I discovered that entirely by accident. When I actually pulled the bike cover down a bit too tight, ready for a windy day, ready to strap it down, and actually popped one of the indicators out of the fairing. The other technique that's been tried, and back in the 80s Honda did this, they tried to solve the problem with bendy rubber stems, but after a couple of years there was a problem with those. The stems actually drooped. So if you look at some of the old Hondas from the 1980s, they sort of have saggy indicators, which is a fairly unpleasant look. So here is the latest take on this, and this is the Hammer LED. Now if you look closely, what you'll see is that between the indicator sort of mount and the LEDs themselves, what you've actually got is a high tensile spring. Fairly sensible, fairly simple actually. They're said to be durable, flexible, waterproof, ultra bright and E-marked, so they are legal to fit to any motorcycle on the road, and they are said to be 360 degree bendable and 100% drop proof. Now I'm not sure that you'd actually need to bend them 360 degrees, because then they go right round and they'd be pointing the same way as they started, but a right angle or so should be sufficient, so long as the spring is not so powerful that it puts stress on the fairing through which the thing is mounted. The indicators themselves are supposed to be high impact aluminium and steel, so hopefully they will be durable. They're also said to be waterproof, and hopefully they'll be reasonably reliable. Now, compared with some of the sort of no-name eBay replacement indicators, they're not cheap, but when you consider the price of a side panel, for example, they're really not that expensive. So a set of 4 at the moment with a replacement relay will set you back £172, and the indicator, one indicator alone, should you for some reason need a replacement, is from £41, or at least they would be if the website didn't say completely sold out. But if you want more info on those, head to their sales site, which is hammerleds.com. I've just popped it up there in the comment stream for you to look at. So something to think about. They're better than a lot of the LEDs that I see on the market. So, okay, what have we got for you to round the show off? Well, we've got some news on bikes, and what is the first piece of news on bikes? Well, the 440 class seems to be flavour of the month, and these bikes will fit the A2 licence, of course. So after we got over all the excitement of the Bajaj Triumph 400s and the baby Harley Davidson X440, news from India reveals that Harley Davidson's Indian partner Hero Motorcorp have filed a trademark for a Nightster 440, clearly hinting at a second motorcycle under the Harley Hero partnership. Now the suffix suggests that it's going to be the same 440 engine revealed in the X440 to go in the Nightster, so expect it to be a single cylinder with sort of just bodywork changes and the riding position change. Rather more interesting in some ways, if you like your motorcycles, is this particular machine, which has been seen out and about in India. Now I'll focus in on the closer of the two bikes. The one behind it apparently is a Moto Guzzi, but this is an Aprilia, and it's believed to be the soon to appear Aprilia 450. Let's give you a close-in look at that. There it is. It's been seen out on the road in India carrying what appears to be a data logger on the back seat there, or on the rack. And it also appears to be fitted with RS660 bodywork. So the implication there is that the bike is getting close to readiness for the road. Now, there have been a number of reports in the press that the bike would be fitted with a 440cc liquid cooled double overhead cam, 4-valve parallel twin, derived from the current 660 parallel twin found in the RS660, but the design of the clutch cover suggests something different. It's not shared with any other current Aprilia bike. It appears to be noticeably smaller than the clutch on the RS660, and it leaves me and some other commentators online wondering if we're not actually looking at a single cylinder motorcycle, and that has been supported by some people who've suggested that there is only one downpipe hidden behind the fairing there, which would imply, of course, a single. Now, why would you want a single rather than a twin? Well, it's lighter. You make better use, really, of the limited power output from a single cylinder to fit the A2 class. It's cheaper to manufacture, and thus eventually the eventual market price could be kept a bit lower, and probably the company can make rather more profit out of building a single rather than making another twin cylinder motor. Anyway, whatever the engine, it will undoubtedly target the A2 license category, where the power output is 35 kilowatts or 46.6 horsepower. So that would drop it into the hole between the learner legal RS125 and the 99 horsepower RS660. Hopefully it will be a bit more reliable than the 660 has proven to be. Now, the aluminium twin spar frame, that does look similar to the 660, presumably why the bike is showing the same bodywork, tank and seat, but the rear swing arm appears to be of steel rather than alloy. 17-inch front wheel is down to a single radial disc. Front forks are inverted, the rear gets the standard monoshock treatment, and the tyres are apparently TVS Euro grip, which are produced in India and highly unlikely to perform as well as the 660's Pirellis. Anyway, so that leads us to the next question: where is the bike being built? Well, let's remember who owns Aprilia. It's actually Piaggio, not just the biggest manufacturer of scooters in Europe, but they also have owned Aprilia for 20 years. I tend to forget that myself. Now, back in February, Piaggio announced that they were working on plans to enter the middleweight market under the Aprilia brand. At the same time, they announced a global motorcycle project, quote, that will be focused on all the countries where we have our factories. Now, right now, Piaggio have factories in Italy, as you would expect, but they also have factories in Vietnam, Indonesia and China. And they also have a factory at Baramati in India. And this is where the bike has been seen on test, near that factory. So I'd say it's highly likely that that's where the bike's going to be built. Now, if the RS440 makes sense in India, it's also likely to do so well in other emerging markets, which are beginning to demand more sophistication than the sort of 125 and 150cc bikes that have dominated sales for years. It's also being predicted that the new Aprilia will arrive in time for a launch at the inaugural Indian MotoGP. Now, that is set to be held from the 22nd to the 24th of September. So that launch date for the Indian market, of course, happens to be perfect timing for the bike to appear at the autumn motorcycle round of shows in Europe and also the UK. And of course, that's where Triumph will be revealing their 400s for the UK and European markets. So will the baby Aprilia arrive in the UK? My guess, given the success of the first Royal Enfield, and particularly given the interest in the new Triumph, I suspect it will appeal to a fresh generation of riders, and particularly as this one is a sort of sporty, sort of race rep kind of big bike. It could fill a hole that really only it's the KTM, isn't it? It's their sporty version of the 390. Drops into the RC 390, isn't it? That's what it's called. And there's one thing, if there's a sports bike on the way from Aprilia, the 200 won't be far behind. So we can expect, I think, 2 new models. Right, now on to the final part of the show. I've been talking over the last few weeks about road safety campaigns and questioning whether they're really doing anything sensible, whether they're put in the right places. Now, I started by looking at a Warwickshire campaign where the person who was zip tying the signs to telegraph poles said that they must be putting them in the right place because lots of bikes were going past them. Now, Doc Bike have also been putting up signs in Dorset. I talked about those in recent shows, and I got dropped a line by Cheryl Silver, who's one of the researchers for the team, and she told me, this is quite interesting, Doc Bike have compiled a very detailed Excel sheet with key crash sites taken from Crash Map, local road safety partnership data and real-time data, and then each junction has been assessed for best placement of the signs. This part of the work has been very time consuming because we literally rode or drove around Dorset assessing each site. Now, to me, that would sound like a much more sophisticated way of assessing the much more data-driven way of assessing your likely sites, rather than simply counting passing bikes as you actually stick the sign up. Now, here is another scheme, and thanks to Hallam for alerting me to this. It's also data-driven, and it's believed to be the biggest, the most in-depth investigation of motorcycle rider behaviour anywhere in the world. Now, this is up in Scotland, and it's being run under the auspices of Professor Alex Steadman. Now, he is an expert in rider behaviour and psychology. Some years ago, he produced a high-fidelity simulator which allowed him to monitor rider performance on literally on a rolling road. He also gave a presentation at one of the fire bike conferences where I was also a speaker, so I have spoken to him, and he's a jolly nice bloke and a biker. So he's led the research, and it's said that his work obviously ensures academic rigour throughout. So what's he been working on? Well, some special markings with the slightly cheesy name of perceptual rider information for maximising expertise and enjoyment, or primes for short. And these are designed to help riders make better decisions when approaching left-hand bends. Now, this is the sort of sign that you would see on the approach to one of these prime sites. They are described as gateway markings, so you'll get a warning like this that the road markings are up ahead, and then you get these paint markings on the road designed to funnel riders into a particular line around the corner. So the sign nudges the rider, or primes the rider, to think ahead, and the white lines then nudge the riders onto a specific line designed to keep the rider out of trouble. Now, these are on left-handers. Why? Well, simply because the most common serious or fatal cornering crash happens when riders overshoot the centre line on a bend. It's a left-hander here in the UK, of course, right-hander in the US and in countries that drive on the other side of the road. But whatever the direction, whatever the side of the road we ride on, the problem is when the rider crosses the centre line and finds a vehicle coming the other way. Now, many people here in the UK still wrongly believe that when they hear about a head-on collision involving a motorcycle on a bend, it must be the other driver's fault, but that's simply not borne out by crash data. It does happen that car drivers and lorry drivers cross the centre line, impact motorcyclists who are minding their own business, but it's far more likely that it's the rider who gets it wrong, and hence the interest in any technique that keeps riders on the correct side of the road. Now, primes are grounded in solid science, the theory of human factors, and applied psychology, and you'll know that's sort of topics I've been interested in for years. Transport Scotland do get a bit carried away by describing them as new and innovative, because I know for a fact that similar perceptual countermeasures, as they're known, these kind of road markings have been trialled in Australia and New Zealand. In fact, I specifically went to see one of the trial sites on the Coromandel Loop on the North Island of New Zealand, which uses very similar paint markings to nudge the rider onto a better line for the bend. And there was a sort of somewhat similar trial in the UK which used some modified chevron signs. I can't find any information about that. I lost what I'd stored, computer crashed, I can't find it online anymore, sadly. But have they worked anyway? Fiona Hislop, she's a member of the Scottish Parliament and the Minister for Transport. She described the results as astounding and a real triumph for road safety. Now, what they say is in the report that after prime road markings were installed, there was a significant reduction in speed and significant improvement in road position and braking behaviour, which is interesting. The press release also says that since the start of the trials, there have been no motorcycle injury collisions at any of the previously identified accident cluster sites where prime markings have been deployed. Now, I do caution people to remember that before you assume that this is a magic bullet that automatically solves motorcycle crashes, it is necessary to understand that motorcycle crashes are still the exception rather than the rule. We don't fall off every single time we go around a bend, particularly when we're talking about something like a cornering overrun. Most times we overshoot the centre line, there's nothing coming the other way. Now, even when we do crash, the bad ones are often surprisingly scattered randomly, and this is actually the collision plot data that from the website I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, and this looks at the fatal accident sites over a 10-year period in the west of Scotland, and you see that they are pretty randomly distributed. There are a few bigger blobs which represent clusters in the sort of near area, but most of them are just sort of one-off crashes scattered pretty much all over the place. But interestingly, when you add serious injuries into that, something happens. Because of the nature of the terrain, what you see is that riders are being funneled along specific routes. You don't simply drive over the top of a mountain, you go around the edge of it. And so there simply aren't the huge number of roads you find in the lowlands, and what you find now is that the crashes are happening on relatively few roads, because Scotland has relatively few roads, and of course that means you have a big advantage in placing the trial sites and testing whether you have an effective intervention. And the same holds true, incidentally, for the Coromandel in New Zealand, because it's one road that loops around the peninsula. And the other thing I just want to bring out is just how immense this trial actually is. Now, I've already mentioned that the prime markings, I think I did, have gone in at 22 trial sites, but the video data at each site has been collected over a 3-year period. Now, even allowing for the 2020 lockdown, that means researchers got footage of more than 32,000 motorcycles passing the markings, and each video clip was then manually assessed to see if the markings improved the rider behaviour of passing riders. So they would have had before and after footage, and the conclusion is that there was a real change to be seen. I'd like to actually see the raw sort of data, the paper itself that will undoubtedly appear written on this, but at the moment I'm having to work from the press release. Now, I have been critical of the Warwickshire scheme. I hope what I've offered you today with the Dock Bike and the Transport Scotland scheme is an insight into the sheer scale of the number crunching that really is necessary to gain meaningful data and meaningful insights, and because those are absolutely essential if interventions go up where they matter. Now, as I said, the other thing, of course, is the intervention has to make sense to riders too. Now, Professor Stedman was quoted as saying, "Throughout Project Prime, we've taken a user-centred approach to develop a safety solution that riders will accept and use. It's very much for motorcyclists and by motorcyclists." So, sum up and quote the press release, the Prime project aligns with the Safe System approach, which represents an ambitious safety performance level and current best practice safety culture in road safety. Prime Prime addresses 3 of the 5 safe system foundations: safe speeds, safe road use, safe roads and roadsides. So here's some good news. The research funding provided by the Road Safety Trust to Transport Scotland to carry out this trial was significantly less than £250,000. Now that may seem like a lot of money, and I'd like to see the installation cost for each site, but in the grand scheme of things, road building, I suspect it's a relatively inexpensive intervention. I had a quick look to see what else I could find and have a think, well, in context with, for example, the London East-West Super Highway for cycles, which hives off bicycles and puts them in their own designated lane. That runs from Lancaster Gate to Tower Hill. It's a distance of 5.5 miles. It opened in 2016 and it cost £47 million. So almost a quarter of what the Scotland scheme cost just to do 5 miles of cycle lane. Now the TfL investment is defended as a long-term investment, but the same applies to interventions like Prime. Once an effective intervention is identified, it can be maintained in a collision hotspot. But here's the real deal: it can be deployed elsewhere, wherever needed, wherever a problem is identified. And the press pack indeed says next step will be the production of a guidance pack for road authorities in Scotland on how they can implement primes in their area. And let's hope that authorities in the rest of the UK sit up and take notice too. But final point, let's not lose sight of the fact that many dangerous bends on roads are already flagged up for us by bend warning signs and black and white chevrons. If riders were aware of why these signs go up, the triangular signs tell us other people have crashed, the chevron tells us where they crash, and if riders were given the right coaching to look for these signs, see them and then respond to them, I think we'd have fewer cornering crashes right across the UK, and that information is right out there in front of us all the time. Right. Kevin says, any link appreciated. At the moment, only the press release. As I said, I will be looking to see if I can find a paper attached to it. Curious to know if the markings encourage lines and positioning in bends as suggested by the IAM and ROSPA. Now that is an interesting question, and one I'm going to leave for today, but my gut feeling is that the lines that the interventions are nudging riders onto will be more cautious lines than those traditionally encouraged by the advanced riding groups. Far more akin, to be honest, to the lines that I recommend that riders ride through corners, and the lines that I myself have learnt from experience are safer. So, right, thank you all for watching today. That's it. Don't forget, if you are out there on the roads today, the weather forecast is deteriorating as the day goes on, so cross fingers for the test match and whether England can finish off the Aussies today. I certainly hope they do. If you want to support the show, of course, I mentioned the supporters at the top of the show, but do pop over to my Ko-fi page where you can get access to hundreds of better biking articles, as well as drop me a cuppa. All those are most appreciated. And finally, if you are out there on the road today, do make sure that you stay shiny side up. Thanks for looking in. I'm Kevin Williams. This has been Elevenses. Thank you once again for watching.